The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, Len B.A., and I am pleased to have as my guest today, John Hunt. John Hunt is a collaborator at the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation and a research toxicologist with the University of California, Davis. For over 20 years, he co-directed the Marine Pollution Studies Laboratory at Granite Canyon on the Big Sur Coast, doing water pollution research around Monterey Bay and throughout California. He holds a Ph.D. degree in environmental studies from UC Santa Cruz and has published 60 scientific journal articles. His most recent work has been in support of wetland restoration and other water resource management projects. He's served for 12 years on the Santa Cruz County Commission on the Environment, which focuses primarily on climate change risk reduction and environmental justice. He recently joined a small team at the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation to write a successful grant proposal to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to fund climate adaptation projects that make vulnerable Monterey Bay communities more resilient to climate change impacts. The proposal brought together 21 partners from around the region to join the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation to help reduce risks from floods and wildfires and build capacity for future climate adaptation work. John Hunt, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Len. It's great to be here.
Well, you have a background in toxic pollution and in wetland restoration. What's your connection with the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation?
I've been working around the watersheds of Monterey Bay my entire career. I've gotten to know a lot of people that have been doing wetland restoration. We got involved from a toxicological point of view with wetland restoration because wetlands can take up pollutants such as pesticides or trace metals or industrial pollutants and break them down into less harmful substances or hold them in place so that sunlight or changes in oxygen can break them down. So wetlands can be a treatment system, a natural treatment system for breaking down pollutants. And ideally, you'd have these types of treatments upstream of valuable water bodies like the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. So we've worked in the watersheds trying to keep pollutants that flow off the land from getting into important places in the water.
Wonderful. Yeah. And the role of wetlands, I mean, I think that's going to come up too in terms of our discussion about dealing with the effects of climate change. As climate change accelerates and we continue to make, little progress toward reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, more and more attention is being turned to how we need to adapt to the consequences of climate change. So could you talk a little about some of the changes we can anticipate as the climate continues to heat up?
Yeah, I want to mention, just based on what you were saying, that a lot of the work that's been done over the last few decades has been trying to reduce the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere. Mostly that's usually called mitigation. So mitigation has been the focus largely because a lot of the legislation from the state of California and elsewhere requests people or requires people to reduce their carbon. But we know that carbon's getting into the atmosphere. We know that the planet's heating up, that the sea level's rising. So we need to be ready for that. We need to do what we can do to prevent the worst impacts. So those types of efforts are generally called adaptation or building resilience to the impacts we expect will be coming from climate change.
Yeah, and what are some of the things that, I mean, obviously warmer weather, and we've witnessed, droughts that have contributed to wildfire hazard. We've also seen more extreme rainfall levels, storms that just dump a lot more moisture a lot faster, kind of everything in overdrive. But kind of in the big picture, what kinds of impacts can we anticipate for this region?
Well, one thing globally that puts some of this into perspective is that most of the world's large cities were built on estuaries because that was a really good place to put a harbor. So if you think of London or Hong Kong or San Francisco or places all over New York, New Orleans, so they're very close to sea level, and the impacts just of sea level rising are going to be tremendous. If you look at Superstorm Sandy, 15 years ago, the amount of damage that was done in Miami, seawater comes up through the storm drains. So sea level is also an issue here around Monterey Bay. A number of the highways, Highway 1, say through Moss Landing, or many of the local roads around Twin Lakes or elsewhere are subject to storm surge during high tides, and that will only increase as sea level rises. I was just looking at the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It looks like, first of all, the rate of sea level rise is increasing, so it's rising faster than it used to. But even at the current rate, in about 25 years, we can expect another half the sea level to be 6 inches higher, which may not sound like much, but if you've got a 6.5 or a 7 foot tide and you add 6 inches onto that, it's going to come surging over roadways, railways. A lot of our wastewater infrastructure is close to sea level because everything has to flow downhill to the wastewater treatment plants. And I always think about the old joke about a crocagator, but if you lose your wastewater treatment plants, you're in big trouble. So critical infrastructure. Also, seawater intrusion is a problem for our freshwater aquifers. And as the sea level rises, it puts more pressure, forcing water into aquifers, and also surging overland where it can soak into the soil. Wildfires, we know about that. We had probably, about 15 dry years out of the last 18 or so, and we saw what that did to our forests and how vulnerable they are to wildfire with that. Heat's not such a big deal around Monterey Bay. Luckily, we've got that big air conditioner of the ocean out there in the bay. But wildfire smoke was really rough on farm workers and people that had to work outside. So the big impacts that are happening worldwide happen here around Monterey Bay.
Yeah, and being as close as we are to sea level, it's all of those consequences with. And again, aggravated sometimes by storm surge or storm surge combined with high tide, and it doesn't take a lot to push it all forward. So it was just announced that these federal grant funds were awarded, $71.1 million coming to the Monterey Bay area to adapt to climate change. What was your role in putting together this grant proposal?
I've been working on wetland projects and other types of restoration projects for a number of years, and that involves a lot of meetings. And I was at a meeting along with a number of other people that got involved with this grant proposal. In early July of last year, someone put out the word that there was this very large NOAA program, $575 million nationwide, and that the maximum award amount was going to be $75 million. It was a nationwide competition, very competitive grant. But we knew that there were a number of organizations around Monterey Bay that had projects already designed. They'd already been vetted through regional planning. And we thought we could put together a large team with a lot of good projects. So we all basically looked at each other around the table and said, let's do this. And Robert Mazurek, who's the director of the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, he just kind of took a deep breath and said, well, let's win it then. And he made his staff available to help work on this. And we set to it. We wrote a 5-page letter of intent that was due in mid-August. 850 letters of intent were submitted to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And of those 850, about 120 were invited to pursue full proposals. And we were invited to do a full proposal. So we started on that in mid-October, and the proposal was due in mid-February. And that was a lot of work because I think I would have to guess ours was one of the more complicated proposals submitted because we had 21 partners along with the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And all of those partners chipped in a big way, provided us with a lot of good stuff, and we were able to put it all together. And I thought when we looked at it at the end, I thought, this is great. Who's going to beat this? So then when it all panned out, there were 8 awards nationwide.
Wow, only 8.
Only
nationwide.
8.
Yeah.
And we were
That's
actually
amazing.
the only one in California.
Oh, no kidding.
Which surprised me because I still don't know who else was submitting proposals, but we expected. I know there's some very talented organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area and Southern California, so I don't know whether they actually submitted proposals or not. But we were very, very happy with a nationwide challenge like this to come out with one of the grants.
So what are some of the projects the grant will pay for?
Let me back up for a second, just thinking about how this program came together. Yeah. This was a program that was managed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The funds came from the Inflation Reduction Act, which President Biden signed in 2022, I believe.
Yeah.
And there was a commitment to doing a lot of infrastructure work to prepare for climate impacts. When President Biden visited Santa Cruz County after the storms in January of 2023, people who were there said it seemed to really make an impact on him, and he said he would do something about it. And then 6 months later, some of the Inflation Reduction Act funding went into this NOAA program. So maybe the people of Santa Cruz, through the suffering of losing the wharfs and the other damage, played a role in bringing this national attention that ended up in this program.
Wow.
Yeah.
And interesting. It's always hard to tell how all those processes are working, in the multiple players involved for federal agencies and state agencies and everything else. Yeah.
So you asked about the partners. I think. A great list of partners. We've got universities, we have community-based organizations, nonprofits, land trusts, government agencies, both local and regional. I can actually go through the list a little bit, which I should do, and just take a minute to read off everyone's who's on this, because I'm sure that people in the audience are going to know or work with some of these groups. So would that be all right?
Yeah, please.
Okay, just more or less in alphabetical order. The Big Sur Land Trust, California State Parks, CSUMB, California State University, Monterey Bay, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative, Central Coast Prescribed Burn Association, and we'll get into that in a bit, Central Coast Wetlands Group, the City of Santa Cruz, City of Watsonville, Coastal Conservation and Research, Collaborative for Right Relations, which is a group representing tribal and indigenous interests, Community Foundation of Santa Cruz County, Ecology Action, the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, Four Directions, which is also an indigenous organization, Groundswell Coastal Ecology, Hartnell College, the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, Monterey Bay Climate Justice Collaborative, Monterey Bay Climate Project Working Group, Monterey County Water Resources Agency, the Pajaro Regional Flood Management Agency, Pajaro Storm Drain Maintenance District, Peninsula Open Space Trust, Regeneracion Pajaro Valley, Resource Conservation District of Monterey County, the Santa Lucia Conservancy, the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Watsonville Wetlands Watch.
Wow. Yeah.
So if you don't know someone on that
broad
list, spectrum of you got to get out.
And I've had people from at least a few of those organizations on this program. So yeah,
there are really tremendous people in all these organizations, and they. The proposal itself was over 600 pages. I think it's about 650 pages. And each of these groups provided, at least 10, 15, 20 pages of text, along with detailed budget tables that I'll mention in a bit. But it was, we went back and forth with each partner many, many times, trying to focus down on what we thought was the theme that really would resonate with the NOAA program. And everybody, people had really good things. And I come from a water quality background, and we had partners that had water quality projects within their project. And we had to tell them to remove that water quality piece so we could stay focused on climate adaptation. So hopefully they'll fund that a different way. But it was a real interesting process of staying focused on what needed to be done.
And I'm sure that focus had an impact on getting the award.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So listeners, if you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at K-Squid, my guest is John Hunt. He is a co-author of a successful grant proposal that is bringing in over $70 million in federal grant funds for climate change adaptation projects in the Monterey Bay area. And so you were talking about, John, about the organizations that are involved, and in fact even like refining project scope to make sure it was really focused on climate change adaptation. And I wonder if you could give us a few examples of some of the pieces that the different organizations are doing.
Great. Not only refining the scope, but also trying to keep everything within budget. We applied for $75 million, which is about 100 times larger than any grant proposal I've worked on before. And you would think that would cover just about everything, but we had to turn away partner projects, and we had to basically really chip away at everybody's budget to make it all fit. So I really appreciate that, too, from all the partners. Nobody got greedy. Nobody got upset. Everybody was team players. Said, okay, well, for that we can do this, and we would shuffle things around. So there's a grand theme of this that I think everyone here, all the people that worked on this proposal, had in mind to begin with anyway for quite some time. The way that NOAA laid out the program, it fit this really nicely. And our theme for this was to increase the adaptive capacity and the resilience to overcome impacts for the most vulnerable communities around Monterey Bay, and to create adaptive capacity for flooding from both river floods, sea level rise, and storm surge, and also wildfires. Most of the low-lying communities, such as the beach flats in Watsonville, you can think about the Rio Del Mar flats, Castroville, Watsonville, Pajaro, a number of places often have fairly large low-income communities that don't have a lot of capacity to deal with these additional impacts. So the theme was to take a watershed perspective and look at all the watersheds that flow into Monterey Bay. And that we also included the Carmel River watershed. So it's the San Lorenzo River that flows down into Santa Cruz, the Pajaro River that flows into Watsonville and Pajaro, the Salinas River that flows into Salinas and Castroville, and the Carmel River. Because there are a lot of flooding issues at the bottom of the Carmel River as well. And then look at also ways to reduce wildfire risk in those watersheds. So one of my favorite examples is the Pajaro River and the areas from the city of Watsonville and the town of Pajaro towards the ocean. A number of years ago, there was a large swell. I don't think it was actually a storm. I think it was a large swell from a distant storm that coincided with a king tide in January that sent a lot of water into the Pajaro River mouth and over onto farmland, so that there were acres of farmland at the base of the Pajaro River that were flooded with seawater.
Yeah, and salt water does not go well with growing crops.
Exactly. So the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County took a look at this. What is now the Pajaro Regional Flood Management Agency was already looking at this, and you've heard lots of news about the work that's going to be done with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Pajaro Regional Flood Management Agency to make the river flooding less impactful. But the areas right near the mouth of the river were still vulnerable. And the city of Watsonville, the seaward neighborhoods in the city of Watsonville sit at about 12 to 15 feet above mean low or low water. So that means they're maybe only 5 or 6 feet above high tide. And it's just flat farmland between the ocean and Watsonville. So the idea was to create what could be called accommodation space for floodwaters, a place for the floodwaters to go where they could be absorbed and the key flows could be attenuated so that the floodwaters don't go into towns or onto farmland. Mm-hmm. So around the Watsonville Slough area at the base of the Pajaro River, the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County had been working for a while on purchasing easements from landowners there, easements and in some cases actually fee purchases of land that was no longer as viable for farming because it was so floodable. Then, having purchased the land, the idea would be to restore the wetlands that are there because vegetated wetlands attenuate flood flows much better than, say, a pond or a mud flat, because the vegetation can dampen the flows. It's not so erosive. It lasts longer. So the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County is doing a major project there that's part of this proposal. The County of Santa Cruz, through the Pajaro Storm Drain Maintenance District, which the county manages, is also doing they're taking ownership of land that's owned by the state parks and already by the county, and they're going to do wetland restoration, and it's immediately adjacent to the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County's property. And I think we're ending up with about 2 miles of land that's right at the barrier between the ocean and the farmland that's going to be restored. And I think it's going to do a great job of making that farmland less floodable. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I want to say is further upstream, where Salsapuedes Creek comes into the Pajaro River, the Pajaro Regional Flood Management Agency has got I think it's about a 60-acre parcel that they're going to purchase right at the confluence and also do wetland restoration there so that during floods, that doesn't become a choke point, so it spills over into the Beach Street neighborhood, which has been frequently flooded before. And one other neat aspect to that is not only will they do wetland restoration, but they're going to be reaching out to the community to ask whether disadvantaged farmers and ranchers might want to use that land for farming at a discount rate, knowing that it's going to flood once in a while.
Right.
So it's pretty creative, I think. And you put that all together, and it really lowers the flood risk for Pajaro and Watsonville.
Yeah,
and the farmland.
And I've heard similar work going on in other parts of the world. For example, I'm forgetting the species now, but a species of tree that grows in wetland,
like a mangrove.
Mangroves, and that mangroves and a lot of tropical climates in particular play a huge role in mitigating the amount of wave action and also increasing the absorption rate of the soil underneath them. Right. For moisture, and that's it's amazing. If you didn't know it beforehand, the wetlands as a living system is something that has been acted as a buffer between the ocean and the land itself for forever, right. And where we've filled them in or torn up the vegetation, we've really compromised that, and we certainly saw that. In the storm surge that hit New Orleans with hurricanes, because they had a lot of wetland forest right on the shore, and a lot of it's gone, and so those impacts are much more severe. So
if I can,
please.
I'd just like to also mention that I mentioned the Pajaro River, but we have similar projects going on all the other 4 rivers. On the San Lorenzo, the benchlands behind the county building are going to be restored to absorb some flood flows. Also, Jenny Street Marsh, a little further downstream, to absorb river flooding. And then there'll be a project called a living shoreline in front of the Beach Flats neighborhood, which is to build dunes that are resilient to large wave action. So that tends to protect the low-lying area there at the Beach Flats. And there are a number of living dunes, living shoreline projects around Monterey Bay as part of this. I think there'll be 4. Then in Salinas River, there's also some wetland restoration going on, similar to the Pajaro. And at the Carmel River, the Big Sur Land Trust has an ongoing project called the Carmel River. Well, it's Carmel Free, and I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a wetland restoration project there, because the neighborhoods there, not as disadvantaged income-wise, but they're flooding as well. So all 4 rivers have wetland restoration projects to make them more resilient and protect the local communities.
Yeah, and here we are, looking at just the Monterey Bay area, over $70 million, and you had to trim a lot and exclude some of the partners in order to get to that budget. And I've seen numbers floated around of, estimates of the cost of reversing climate change, for example, or the cost of adapting to it, and it's very big numbers. I mean, especially when you look nationwide or globally, very, very large numbers. So, I mean, 71 million sounds like a lot to me, but then I know that we spend, more than that to add a couple lanes to the highway for a few miles. So it's like, if we were to put this in scale, how would you describe what is going to be done with this grant money compared to what we might actually need to do within the next generation, say?
That's a really good question. We're really looking at this as an investment in an ounce of prevention and hoping that we can get a pound of cure out of it, because it's even more than a 16-to-1 ratio between the cost of repairing after climate impacts and the cost of prevention by doing adaptation actions in advance. So we feel it's money very well spent. In Santa Cruz County right now, I think they're looking at a $400 million backlog for road repairs from the last 2 winter storms. And then, of course, the fires that often exacerbate sediment flows and that sort of thing. So just in Santa Cruz County, and just looking at road repairs, that's $400 million versus what we consider a huge grant at $71 million for adaptation action. So yeah, it's definitely investment. It's an ounce of prevention, and yeah, I think the public in general is getting used to the idea that climate impacts are expensive, and they're expensive for homeowners. They're expensive for businesses. A lot of the critical infrastructure for our cities, like waste treatment plants in particular, are located at low ground. So the costs are going to be high, and we're not used to paying those costs either personally or through government repair work. And usually, with the current situation with county roads, county asks for an assessment to help fix the roads. People say the old line from, I don't know, the 50s or something, that government just doesn't spend money well. But it's the real case is the costs are going up, and a lot of it is driven by climate.
Right. And, then you look at how the private sector spends money. It's like, well, at least we have a margin of accountability when it's government money. Yeah. And it is interesting to see, it's been a while now, but I had Assistant Director of Public Works on this program a few years ago. I think it's now a few years, talking about the maintenance of roads. And they have, they've gotten some increased revenues, both from a Senate bill that increased revenues for road maintenance, and also from local taxes that we passed here, and those Measure M funds, that the portion that goes to road maintenance. And all it did was slow the rate of an accumulating backlog of maintenance work. It's still a growing backlog, and they, my impression is they do a very good job of prioritizing, because they simply can't do it all. but they're looking at that, So this is, as you say, an ounce of prevention goes a long ways, and they do road repairs in the same sense. It's cheaper to resurface it before it has a lot of potholes than to come in when there's 20 potholes and you have to redo the whole ground, the whole base rock layer and everything. So it's better to keep it up when you can. Well, we're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back with more with John Hunt right after this. Don't go away. So if you have just tuned in recently, my guest is John Hunt. John Hunt is a scientist who has worked a lot in marine pollution and toxicology. And he is one of the key authors of a proposal from the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation and 21 collaborating organizations that was just awarded over $71 million in federal funds for climate change adaptation projects here in the Monterey Bay area. And John, we've been talking about some of these particular projects and the areas that are affected more than others. So you mentioned particularly, of course, places that are close to sea level and places that are along rivers where we may or may not have adequate prevention for preventing flooding. There's also, of course, as we know, especially people who try to get fire insurance nowadays up in the hills, there's an increasing risk from wildfires due to extremes in weather and extremes in droughts that periodically our forests are subject to. What are some of the projects that would be helping communities that are vulnerable to wildfires?
Wildfire is obviously an issue we've had. We've had a number of dry years, and that's made us more vulnerable. It's been really interesting for me to see the types of projects that have been in the planning stages, and we're able to get included on this grant, because it's pretty fascinating what the different approaches people are taking to reduce fuels, to reduce the intensity of wildfires. And we have 4 major partners and a number of partners within those partners that are doing targeted grazing to reduce fine fuels of grasses, mechanical removal of flammable brush. There's one project, and I'll mention the project partners in a moment, but one of our project partners is the Peninsula Open Space Trust, which owns property in Vicente Redwoods, which is in the Santa Cruz Mountains in Santa Cruz County. And they are looking at areas that were burned by the CZU fires and have found that they're perhaps even more at risk now, because you have the trees that were not completely burned and the areas that used to be shaded by the forest that now are not shaded and are growing more flammable understory plants. So they're building shaded fuel breaks. They're removing dead trees that are, fuel for fire. They're doing, I think, 6 miles of shaded fuel breaks, which is quite a lot considering what goes into that, to try and reduce the risk of a resurgence of fire in that area that's now a little drier and a little deader after the CZU fire. Mm-hmm. Some of the other partners, the Resource Conservation District of Monterey County did a great job of pulling together people from the Big Sur Land Trust, from the Esalen tribe, from the Amamutsan tribal band, from the Central Coast Prescribed Burn Association and others, to do a number of projects that include prescribed burns, and the prescribed burns include cultural burning, which I'm personally very excited about, because the landscape before European colonization was managed very well for centuries and centuries to use fire to promote the growth of beneficial plants. And there was a lot of indigenous knowledge that's built up around that persists in the current members of those tribes. So the Esalen tribe is a partner on the Basin Ranch near the top of Carmel Valley as it goes over into the Arroyo Seco watershed. There's going to be some prescribed and cultural burning there. Mount Madonna has had a number of prescribed burns up above the city of Watsonville, and there'll be some cultural burning there as well. It's a large group of people. It's prescribed burns. I don't believe. Well, there's a history of prescribed burning that I don't know enough about to comment on, but it's fairly recent where things have really been getting buttoned down in terms of how to do prescribed burns safely, and to deal with the all the ramifications that come with it. So it's the fact that we've got indigenous partners bringing indigenous knowledge to this, to me, is one of the best things, because that's a seed bank of knowledge that's been unused for way too long. So so those are all in watersheds that drain to Monterey Bay, and when a wildfire goes through and burns forest, it tends to sear the soil, make it less permeable for water. It creates runoff hazards, sediment debris flow hazards, flooding hazards. So the fact that we're reducing the risk of fire impacts is great, but it's also helping us reduce the risk of flood impacts downstream.
Yeah, and I witnessed that in the upper part of the San Antonio River watershed, which flows into the Salinas River, that after very big fires a few years ago, tons of sediment came off the sides of the mountains that didn't used to wash off in the rain, and destroyed sections of road where it crossed the roads, but also, at least in the short term, really ruined the habitat of the river, because instead of being a river with a lot of pools and quiet spots and all of that, it just became filled with sand, essentially, just filled with sediment. And for a while, there were no real visible fish, there were no visible frogs. They have started to come back, which is, says something about the resilience of it, but it's also, of course, starting to reform some of those pools. But it's taking years to do that after the fire. So it really underscores how much that loss of vegetation affects the waterways in particular.
You think about gravel beds for salmonid spawning and that sort of thing. They get all silted in and covered over, and that's a really critical piece of the life cycle to keep going. So
yeah, if the fish can't hatch, there's no new fish.
Right.
So you've done a lot of work around wetlands, and you talked a little bit about how wetlands are help to mitigate climate change. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the health of the wetlands here in the Monterey Bay and what you've seen yourself from your work.
I think the number is something like 85% of the wetlands that were in California at the time of European colonization are no longer with us. They've been filled in or dredged for development or for harbors or whatever else. So that landscape is probably the most dramatically changed. That and probably riparian landscape along waterways, rivers. If you look at, for instance, the area in the around the Moss Landing and Salinas, there were at least 7 historic lakes that are now basically farmed, and there's a major effort to purchase that land because it's become less viable for farming. It floods a lot. So it's not that useful, and a lot of that farming is irrigated agriculture, which depletes the aquifers and makes, reduces our supply of fresh water. So there are other state programs by the California Department of Conservation that are being run through the Central Coast Wetlands Group and others to purchase least viable farmland and restore it. There are a lot of wetland experts in the area, and I'm not one of them. So to get into the nuts and bolts of it is beyond me. But I did do a fair amount of work trying to encourage growth in waterways that drain urban and agricultural runoff as a pollution reduction technique. But there's a lot to the wetland side that it's not really my area of expertise. So.
All right. And you mentioned that there were more projects ready to go for climate adaptation here in Monterey Bay area, that simply there wasn't enough funding to go around to cover everything. Do you have a sense of the scale of what might be needed in the next decade or whatever timeline you might be able to assess there?
If you really get into it, if you think about what's happening out on West Cliff, or what could happen anywhere along the bluffs of Monterey Bay, which are not made of granite or basalt. They're made mostly of sand and mudstone that's easily erodible. If you start cutting into the base of the cliffs and the cliffs start failing, there's a lot of property and infrastructure there. And you look at the cost of that, and it would be well worthy of an investment in living shoreline technology that this proposal is just trying to kickstart. I mentioned there'd be 4 living shoreline projects to try to protect the land behind the beach. This is a great opportunity to do some things that have already been tested, but need a lot more testing in Monterey Bay. A lot of it's been done in Southern California, where the surf doesn't get nearly as big. But you could really go on and on with floods and fires, and I think we got a good percentage of the projects that were ready to go in the time frame of the grant. Mm-hmm. But I would bet there was at least twice as many that could have been implemented in the time of the grant that we weren't able to include.
Right. Yeah. So more like $150 million kind of price tag.
Oh gosh,
instead
yeah.
of,
yeah. And it'll NOAA sees this as seed money, even though it's a big grant relatively. They know that a lot of work needs to be done. So
right, whether it comes through them or from some other source at some point.
We should get into the workforce development aspects of this too, because that's really important. There are 4 partners on workforce development, and the idea here is to train the next generation of climate practitioners and scientists to be ready to deal with this in the most efficient way. And the team we put together here, I think, is really neat because of the way it fits together and ladders one to the other. And the partners on this are the Watsonville Wetlands Watch, Hartnell College, California State University, Monterey Bay, and UCSC. Watsonville Wetlands Watch has fantastic programs with high school students, teaching them about wetland restoration. They have a Wetland Restoration Academy. I'm not sure if that's the exact name, but some of the kids, some of the high school kids that go through that program end up going to, Stanford and Ivy League schools, and it's a very motivating thing for people to get out and learn about nature that way, learn about science through nature. They're going to transition to a post-high school, to a young adult academy, a climate adaptation academy. Use the same types of techniques of getting out and doing hands-on wetland restoration work, as well as planning. There's drone technology involved. There's there's permitting. There's a lot of kind of technical stuff that they're going to be offering. And then Hartnell College has an excellent program in agricultural technology that also uses drones and ways to deal with the farmland to make it most productive. They're going to shift some of that to climate adaptation. That's going to be fascinating. They bring a lot of people through that program, and I think that's going to be great. California State University, Monterey Bay, and UCSC are going to have both graduate and undergraduate classes, curricula, internships, externships. I'm still not exactly clear what the difference is between internship and externship is, but I think the externships go out and work with other partners than the university itself. But I think internships do too. I should know that by now, but I wasn't working on that part of the proposal. But it's really fantastic. There's a lot of great job placement with that. All of them have certification and follow up with job placement. There's going to be a lot of smart people that will get a chance to learn about science and the natural world and climate adaptation that otherwise I don't think would get the chance without this. So it's really good.
That's great. I love that there's an integration of the education component and job training and workforce development with the work itself, because clearly we need more and more people who do know how to do this kind of work going forward. Yeah,
and I think there's a real untapped reservoir of talent in areas where people may not be able to afford to go to school or whatever. I know the Watsonville Wetlands Watch has been actively recruiting people from disadvantaged communities. Hartnell College, the same. I think there's going to be just a lot of talent that has been untapped till now that's going to really help us out in the future.
Wonderful. Good. Well, you mentioned a couple things that I thought might warrant a little bit of explanation. One was shaded fuel breaks. Like, what are we talking about when you're talking about a shaded fuel break?
Yeah, another area that's not my expertise. I think that if you look around the landscape now, especially in areas with chaparral, you'll see fuel breaks. You'll see those dirt roads basically going up and over. And I think the idea is to be a little more ecologically minded by having forest in place to shade out the shrubbery and the grasses that are more flammable. I'll leave it at that. I'll learn a lot about that in the next few months, but it's
I've
basically
seen some
more
of it done where there's been prescribed burns done within a forest, so it's under a forest canopy. Yeah. I suppose, maybe this is something having to do with actually planting trees. I don't know, but in these cases, you have all that underbrush stuff cleared, and you don't have enough fuel anymore to get hot enough to actually cause the trees to burn up.
To get up into the canopy.
Yeah, so I mean, they might scar, there might be enough grass or something to do some burn scars on the base of the trunk, but not enough to get the whole tree burning. So
I should have mentioned that with the, I know at least with the Peninsula Open Space Trust, San Vicente Redwoods project, they are, a lot of the work they're doing, the fuel reduction, et cetera, is in preparation for future prescribed burns. Mm-hmm. So there won't be, in that particular project, there won't be prescribed burning, but the shaded fuel breaks, et cetera, I think are being set up for what you just described.
Yeah, and it's, in a lot of places we've got so much buildup of fuel that, you can't do a prescribed burn unless you remove some of the fuel first, because it's just going to get too hot no matter what.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and it's amazing how the input from indigenous groups and the cultural legacy they have of burning is really added to the body of knowledge in how to conduct burns that are healthy for the forest or for the chaparral areas. And you also mentioned living shoreline, and can you give us a sort of primer of what that's about?
Yeah, I've looked at some of the designs, and usually what happens is they will prepare the beach with a shallow trench going parallel to the shoreline, and fill that in with cobble, usually locally sourced cobble, which I assume are rocks that are a foot or more in diameter, maybe a foot to 3 feet, something like that, as an anchor. And then there's often lumber, driftwood, other locally sourced materials that are woven into that base of cobble. Then sand. There's probably smaller rock mixed in too. I can't remember the exact designs, but then a sand dune is built on top, and then the sand dune's vegetated. So the vegetation tends to keep the sand in place, and then even through fairly large wave surges, the dune will erode to a certain extent, but once it gets down to the harder material, it takes a really big swell to move it. And I think this is ambitious in the Monterey Bay area, and by that I don't mean that I do feel that it will be successful, but the waves are pretty big here, and the shore is pretty narrow, and they do sand restorations, additions of sand on the East Coast quite a bit, dredge it from the rivers, put it on the beach. But with this dynamic, it would erode pretty quickly. So I'm really looking forward to seeing these designed living shoreline dunes.
Yeah, and to think of it as cloaked. And there's a few places here, for example, on it's technically Twin Lakes State Beach, but it's the Seabright Beach side of that, the west of the harbor mouth, you would say, where they've some dune plants started to recover on their own, and now they've tried to protect them and fence those areas off so that it really becomes much more well established. And what I've witnessed is it's almost like a skin, like the the vegetation that grows on the dunes kind of holds everything in place, and it tolerates the wind and the wave action much better. Like you say, you can see the very front of the shoreline will get eaten away by winter waves, but as soon as it hits the area with the plants, they're pretty solid and they maintain their shape pretty well. So there's opportunities there.
Yeah, I want to mention one more part. There's 4 main parts to this proposal, and we've mentioned flood risk reduction, wildfire risk reduction, workforce development, and the last one is collaboration and building capacity. One of the key pieces of this proposal is to continue tying all these partners together in what's going to be called the Monterey Bay Climate Adaptation Action Network. That has yet to be built, and it's going to be built by the partners who join that. But we're looking towards having a workforce development committee, a flood risk reduction committee, a wildfire risk reduction committee, and a disadvantaged community, or just an engagement type of committee. I'm not sure what the structure is going to be, but this area has done a fantastic job of coordination, regional coordination, and that's one of the things that really made it possible for us to pull a proposal like this together. Was there's the Climate Justice Coalition that I've read a few of the partners' names, but the Monterey Climate Working Group, a number of collaboratives that are being brought into this umbrella network, and we actually have a few job listings out for some of the key people to help manage that collaborative effort, which you can find at the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation's website. I know we've got a really nice pool of applicants so far, but that's not closed, and we're looking for people that can really work together and technically and management-wise bring this together. But that Monterey Bay Climate Adaptation Action Network is going to be a real force for keeping this moving into the future after the 5 years of this grant.
Great. And is it? Can listeners find this information at the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation website?
They can.
What is that website?
I would just search for the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. I think it's just cmsf.org.
Yeah, and if that doesn't work, try California Marine Sanctuary Foundation in a search, and you'll get it. Yeah. So is there anything that local citizens can do to support these projects?
Definitely. We're really looking for community input. there's and I mean the we in a very large sense of all the project partners are going to be doing community engagement. We really want to know if there's some flood risk that we're not, seeing. If people have ideas, if people have land that's vulnerable that they think might be more useful as a wetland or something else to help build resilience to climate change, that's always great. But there's going to be a large outreach component to this. Ecology Action and Regeneración Pájaro Valley are networking with about 24 community-based organizations to actively get out and seek people's input on this. So if you have ideas, a number of the organizations that are involved in this have volunteer opportunities. So please stay in touch.
Great. And I know a lot of those organizations also network through environteers.org, which is a place where you can volunteer for environmental projects. Mm-hmm. So great. That's wonderful. This is going to be a real community effort around the Monterey Bay for climate adaptation.
I think this region is really well set up for it. It's very community oriented. There's a lot of people that volunteer. There's a lot of people that participate. So I think it's going to be dynamic.
Wonderful. Well, John Hunt, it's been wonderful to have you on the program, and thank you so much for your work in helping to get this grant into the community that's going to make a difference in the future.
Thank you. It's been a great opportunity to talk about it here, and we're looking forward to getting everybody involved.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.